All humans are wired for connection. That's a universal core belief of mine. The truth is, most people are actually much more interested in the journey along the way than even achieving the thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another very special, as always, Next Level Mastermind. So we have a very special guest today. We were lucky enough to interview her, I think last week or the week before. We were lucky enough to see her speak at Brendan Burchard's influencer event, and we were absolutely blown away by her story, her heart, her personality, and her ability to connect with others. Today, we are going to be chatting with Natalie Hodson about the power of vulnerability, authenticity, and connection. Natalie, what is going on?
Hey guys, I'm super excited to be here. Thank you, everybody. This is gonna be a blast. So, and like those guys mentioned, I love seeing stuff come in the chat. So it helps me feel like I'm not just talking to my computer screen here. So if you guys have any questions or want to go deeper into any of these topics, like I'm here for you guys. So we can go any direction that you guys want.
Beautiful. So I'll set the table quickly. So you're an author, you're an entrepreneur, you're a CEO, you're a speaker, you do a lot of amazing things. So Natalie has a lot of knowledge on a lot of things. So feel free to hammer questions. She's a G.
I do. And I also can go in a lot of different directions. So if you guys have questions about business or family stuff or kids or balancing it all or whatever, I tend to talk about all the things. My phrase tag is kind of pulling back the curtain. So there's nothing off topic here. And I'm happy to go any of those directions.
Beautiful. So why don't you tell a little bit about yourself, and you can get into the beginning. Alan said you're going to do some sort of training or something like that. So I'll give you the floor, and then as questions come in after, we'll just kind of go from there.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'm excited. I hope you guys are excited too. So, a little bit about myself. If you guys don't know me, I still say I need to work on my elevator pitch because I don't have like a 10-second, here's what I do. When people say what I do, if I don't want to go into it, I just say internet marketing. But long story short, I always say I accidentally fell into the fitness space about 10 years ago. And I didn't, I was a history major in college, not techie. And I just started writing. I started sharing. I gained 70 pounds when I was pregnant with my first son. He was a 10-pound baby. I literally looked like I had twins. And I just started, it was anonymous, and I started sharing. And I think the reason I was comfortable kind of sharing like the real raw stuff is because I didn't tell anybody in my real life like that I was doing this. And so I felt a little bit braver. And one of the things that I noticed is that whenever I was willing to be just real with people, instead of trying to pretend like I had it all together, I knew it all, that's when people would connect to what I was saying. And so I was, fairly quickly, there were a lot of ups and downs throughout the process. I was able to build a fairly large audience, and then eventually started, turning that into a business. And so here I am today, somewhere I'd never, ever thought I would be. And we do mostly digital products. And then we're able to help and work with a lot of people. We work with about 250,000 different women each year on different various topics. So what I want to talk to you guys about today, though, is a topic that I love talking about. Now, if you would have, and it's vulnerability, authenticity, connection. And if you would have met me 10 years ago, and if you would have known that, Natalie, you would have been like, no way Natalie is talking about this on stage right now. Like, I was Miss Perfect. Everywhere I wanted to look and appear perfect, I call it the curse of the 3 Ps. Anybody else struggle with this? I call it perfectionism, procrastination, paralyzation. If I couldn't be perfect, then I would procrastinate it. And then when I procrastinated too long, I would feel paralyzed. And it was this like really vicious cycle. And so I was able to kind of figure out how to work through that. And now that's that's the heart of everything that I do in my own business and my personal life as well. And I teach it to other people. So I'd love to kind of just talk to you guys about that. So, okay, I have a question for you guys. I want you guys to engage here. So don't worry, you can keep your cameras off. You don't have to turn your cameras on, but I want you guys to put in the chat. In fact, it'd be fun if sometimes I'm able to do polls on like web classes and stuff, but we'll just, or maybe just like give a reaction or something if you watched any of these shows lately. But So, okay, so I got diagnosed with, or I tested positive for COVID last week. So I've been doing a lot of laying on the couch, and I'm not somebody who usually watches a lot of TV, but I couldn't do anything. So I started watching a lot of TV. So I want to know what your guys's like most recent movie that you loved that you watched was. Put it in the chat. I want to hear. Um, if you've watched like a show or a series or a TV show, oh, All American, Game of Thrones, Titanic. Okay. Amy says All American. I haven't even heard of this, so I'm gonna have to go watch this.
The
That's
Lion
awesome.
King.
Oh, cool. The Lion King. Okay, Black Horse, Bridgerton, Queen's Gambit, Soul. Okay, so I love these, you guys. So I also binge watched Queen's Gambit. Like I thought it was gonna be a show about chess, and then I started watching it, stayed up till 3 in the morning, which was really not smart when I should have been resting and getting like better. Maybe that's why I've been sick so long. And I was just like obsessed with her character. I mean, yes, I love chess, but I was obsessed with her character. The other one that somebody turned me on to, and I shouldn't have because it's 5 seasons long and the characters are so good, is Outlander. Has anybody seen Outlander? It's like, oh my gosh, you're going to fall in love with the main character if you haven't seen it yet, but don't watch it in front of kids. It's like definitely not kid friendly. And I like am still watching it. I'm obsessed with it. A couple months ago, we started watching the show called Outpost. Has anybody seen that before? It's like a really intense war movie. It's intense. Like if you don't want to see hardcore stuff, don't watch it. And I think probably my favorite, when people say what's your favorite movie ever, it's always Legends of the Fall. I love Legends of the Fall. Anybody else like, oh man, Brad Pitt, like
Yeah, my mom's favorite movie. She said
yeah.
the peak of male perfection, Brad Pitt in Legends of the Fall.
Oh, I cry. No, I've seen it a zillion times and I still cry when I watch it. Okay, so I ask you guys these questions because I want to start getting the wheels turning in your head. And I want you to think about, have you ever watched a show before where there was a character and when the movie was over, you like couldn't remember the character's name or you couldn't really like say very much about them? Okay, if so, that's usually because the producer didn't do a good enough job of getting you to really draw into that character. And on the flip side, okay, let's go back to King's Gambit. Tom mentioned King's Gambit. Okay, the main character, I love her, not because she's good at chess, right? I could have watched a documentary about a girl who grew up and her was in an orphanage and she learned how to play chess from the janitor, and then she ended up winning like all the World Series, right? Probably wouldn't really remember that movie that well. But the reason that I love Queen's Gambit is because you see all the struggle and the pain that this young girl goes through, from her mom dying to going into an orphanage where they force tranquilizers, and then she gets addicted to tranquilizers, and then she has this mental struggle that she's going along as she's going through her journey, and that makes you drawn to her. You want to in a way see her succeed because you've seen her struggle, right? It's like Outlander. And I don't know, I might be talking gibberish to you guys if you haven't seen it, but you should. It's really good. But the main character, Jamie, you love him because you've seen that he was beaten by British guards and he has scars on his back from all the whips, and you love him because you've seen the struggle that he's gone through. If you just saw this soldier who had always won in every single war, you wouldn't have that feeling of relatability with him. And sometimes it's hard to put that finger on. You're like, why do I like that person, right? And sometimes it's because they're funny. Sometimes it's because they're handsome or beautiful. Sometimes it's because they're kind of dorky, right? But typically, it doesn't matter, their positive qualities. The reason that we fall in love with characters is because we see the struggle that they go through during the process. And in marketing, there's actually a term for this. It's called the hero's two journey, where a lot of times we think, there's the main character and they want to achieve a goal. And that's what they're striving for. But during the process of the movie, you actually see the behind the scenes of like, okay, they're trying to win the race, but then they hit this hurdle or they run into this wall, and you're like, oh no. And you relate to them so much more because you can see the emotion that they went through during the process. And so I'm sharing this with you guys because I think that's something that Hollywood has really tapped into, that if we were able to recognize, so when you're watching a movie, you're not thinking of it usually, unless you're a geek out on marketing like I do, right? You're not typically thinking like, why am I drawn to this character? You just like them. But if you actually like reverse engineer it and look at the characters that you love the most in all your favorite movies, typically it's because you've seen them struggle. You've seen them go through a trial. You've seen them have to endure through stuff that most people don't usually talk about. And it makes them relatable to you because probably in some way you've also struggled with maybe not the exact same thing, but something similar, right? You've struggled with the loss in the Queen's Gambit, the loss of a mother, or you've struggled maybe, I haven't been beaten by British soldiers like an Outlander, but maybe you have felt like somebody in a role of authority has unfairly taken advantage of you, right? And I share that because Hollywood has tapped into something that if we can tap into in our own lives is power, like true power, and the best kind of power possible, because it gives you the ability to connect with people. And one of the things that I believe, I learned this from Brene Brown, is that all humans are wired for connection. That's a universal core belief of mine, is that we all want the same thing. Like I can look at you guys right now and know we all want the same thing. We want to feel seen and heard and understood. And the fastest way to receive that from other people is to give it. And so what I want to talk to you guys about today is, for me, I realized that when I was able to show not just the pretty stuff, right? Not just the cool accolades, the cool things that I've done, but actually just pull the curtain back and show what's really happened, what's really gone on behind the scenes. What it does is two things. One, well, first off, it's scary to do that. It's always scary to be vulnerable. Now, some people don't like the word vulnerable, and I totally get that, especially men. For some reason, they're like, oh no, I'm a dude. I'm not vulnerable. I'm like, okay, let's rephrase this. Maybe just replace that with the word real, right? Like, can you tell me the time you were real? And they're like, oh yeah. But when you're real with people, it creates a connection unlike anything else that I've ever seen before, because all of a sudden people start to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone in thinking this way. I'm not alone in feeling this way. And just like these guys mentioned, one of the things that I found over the years is that there's actually a lot of science that proves this. And I love geeking out on research. And so I have really tried to figure out, okay, when you're real with people, why does that work? And I read a number of studies, and studies have shown that there's actually 16 different topics that tend to, when you're open and honest with them, two things. They tend to, one, trigger shame, but two, are universal, that most people experience at least one of these 16 topics. Typically, it's more than one. And these guys already said it. So for women, the number one shame trigger for women is body image. For men, the number one shame trigger is not being able to provide, not making enough money. And that doesn't mean they can't be applied to men or women. They typically are. And then in not ranked in order, but there's a series of things: appearance and body image, motherhood, fatherhood, family problems, parenting, money, employment, mental and physical health, sex, aging, religion, stereotypes and labels, speaking out. Oftentimes that's more for females than for males, surviving trauma and abuse, and addiction. And I share that with you because probably as I went through that list, if you're anything like me, you're like, oh yeah, I got a story on that. I got a story on that. I got a story on that. And here's one of the things that I found through this research that I've done is that I learned that, so I started to realize at first, okay, when I'm vulnerable, when I'm real, when I share with people, that works. But why does that work? And I started to recognize that there's a link between shame and vulnerability. They're like oil and water. They can't survive together. And so typically what we found is that when you're willing to be more vulnerable on a topic, your level of shame goes down on that, and vice versa. The more shame that you have on a particular topic, the more vulnerable you are, the more your walls go up and you don't want to talk about it. And what I found though, is that we're always going to hit a ceiling in the areas that we have shame, always. And so when you're willing, and trust me, when I first started doing this, I tiptoed into it. I was so nervous to share things, to be real, because I thought people would judge me or make fun of me or think less than of me. And what I found is that when you're the one being vulnerable, it feels so scary. Like I mean, you feel small and scared and not enough. I mean, I've shared things before where like my hand was shaking as I would hit post, and then I wanted to like throw up or instantly regretted, why did I post that? But to everybody else, it looks brave and courageous and makes people feel less alone. And the more that you start to share your stories, it does two things. At least this is what I found, is that um, one, it just makes us more connected, right? We all of a sudden we start sharing something, and somebody else is like, "Oh, I struggle with that too," but I don't know if I would have actually said it out loud. And so it starts to make us feel more connected. People trust you more. You start to develop closer friendships, closer relationships. Um, Oftentimes, relationships that have been burned in the past can get improved. But two, and this was the unexpected positive effect for me, but the coolest part is that it actually made me feel like I was living a more wholehearted life. Like instead of me walking around like this perfect statue, I had connection. I felt seen and heard and understood. And it was really, really scary to take that mask off, to start to show what I actually had gone through or the decisions I made, even if I had regretted them. But once I just, there's a quote, and I'm sure I'm botching it and paraphrasing it, but this is how what I always think in my head is, I think it's a Brene Brown quote. And she said, once you own your stories, those stories no longer have power over you. And that's one of the things that I found. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to go and like tell every single deep, dark secret to the whole entire world, right? One of the rules I go by is it's important to share scars and not open wounds, right? If you're going through something like in the moment, sometimes sharing that to everybody or to the wrong people can do two things. One, it might be too heavy for them to receive. And two, any little shred of criticism can cut you into 1,000 pieces. But if you wait until it's a little bit more of a scar, then that can be a really powerful thing to share with somebody else, to strengthen your connection with them, to make them feel closer to you, to create better friendships, better relationships with your partner, with your kids, with people around you, with your coworkers, and also just to help you move on, move past it, and not feel so much shame about that topic anymore. So that's really what I love talking about and what I would love to talk to you guys about today. I know we just went through the holidays, and sometimes Christmas can be like, even if it was a scar, your family could have like scratched that scab right off, and now it's an open wound again, right? And if you guys, that's kind of the direction I want to go. If you guys have questions on this topic, it was interesting because when I first kind of discovered this, it was through Brene Brown. And if you guys don't know who she is, I'm sure you do. But if not, go watch her Brene Brown TED Talk, and it will you'll probably go down a rabbit hole and watch all her stuff like I did. Go on Amazon and read all her books. But her work really did change my life. And there's been times where I've maybe been, I've learned lessons along the way. There's certain times where there are safe spaces to share in, and there's certain times where there's not. And that's one of the processes that I've learned along the way. Now, the other thing that I get a lot of questions about is people are like, well, should I just be vulnerable all the time? Okay, so let's go back to the Hollywood examples, right? Like the Queen's Gambit. She's not like, you don't see her pain and struggle 100% of the time. They weave it in, right? In Outlander, just because these are the two that are fresh in my mind. They have moments of happiness and joy and cool stuff, right? And it's like, when you're inside your business, if you're sharing, right? Like I don't share vulnerable stuff every single time, right? But I weave it in so that way people know, okay, this girl is not just this perfect Instagram person. She's real and she's a lot like me. And if maybe she could work through it, then I could too. And I guess I would say that's the third cool thing about learning to embrace vulnerability is, for me, I'm so motivated by helping other people. That is what motivates me. And oftentimes when you share your stories, it can give people hope. It can give people hope that, oh my gosh, if she did it, maybe I could too. It's like breaking that 4-minute mile belief system. And I know for me, when I've seen stories of other people who've struggled, it's given me hope that, hey, maybe I could work through that too. And so that's what we want to talk. That's what I want to talk about today, you guys. So, how you can use this in your personal lives, how you can use this if you want to start a business inside your career, and how that can shift your life if you're willing to embrace the gifts of imperfection.
Natalie, thank you for that opening. That was awesome. We already have a few questions
Yeah, they
coming in
beat
through
us
the
to
chat.
it. They beat us to it. I've been waiting. I've been like, wait, oh no, they beat me.
They beat you.
Classic.
They beat me too. Amy, if you could please read the latest questions that came through. I have a feeling this is going to be awesome. I'm pumped.
So there's 2 questions in the chat right now. The first one is thoughts on how to get past sharing your trauma when you feel like parts of you aren't your story to tell. For example, involving a parent's addiction or mental health.
Great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Crystal. So here's been my experience on it. It kind of has a twofold answer. So I will start with the first part. I've gone through very similar stuff. Once I started going through this process myself and realizing how healing it was for me to start sharing my stories, there were certain members of my family who did not like it. We were the perfect, poster on paper. Not when you opened the door and looked actually what was going on, but on paper, we looked like the perfect family. And a lot of my family, in fact, I had a sister who part of my story was my mom was in and out of prison for majority of my life. And not a majority, but for a large part of it as a young child. And my sister did not want me sharing that story. She hadn't told anybody, and she was still really embarrassed by it. And I decided to do a podcast talking about it. And my sister was livid, and she blocked me and sent me a bunch of her thoughts and text messages, and then blocked me. And then a week later, unblocked me and apologized. But what I said back to her was, I said, Megan, look, I said, I only shared things from my perspective of the story and how it impacted me. There are certain parts of the story that weren't my story to tell. And so I didn't. There's certain parts of our story that I don't tell publicly because it's really not my place to tell. It was things that happened with other family members. Did it impact me? Sure. But I think that sometimes it's okay to have some discretion on, whether it's your part or not. Now, what I think for me, what I have stood by this whole time is that I will share my story from my perspective. And I would just tell my family members, look, I'll never stop sharing my stories. It helps me live a more wholehearted life. Now, does that mean that I'm going to slam you to the world? Does that mean that I'm going to paint you in a bad picture? No, I'm going to talk about your good qualities so much more than the pain of this experience. But this is a part of my story and part of my identity. And, and I love you, but I'm unapologetic about it because this is a part of me living a wholehearted life like I want to live. And I'm not going to say that it's going to go without some discomfort or some discordance, because it can. I mean, it did in my own family. But what happened is that instead of me just telling everybody, share your story, share your story, share your stories, usually that doesn't work, right? Have you ever tried to just nag your spouse into making a change and then they're like, it never happens? What I started doing was leading by example and just hoping that my family would see that. And over time, they started to notice that I was happier, that I was living a more wholehearted life, that I wasn't ashamed or embarrassed by what we had gone through anymore. And now that I've been doing this for a decade almost, which sounds crazy, and that makes me feel like I'm old, which I don't think I am, but my family started to be one, more accepting, and two, they started to ask me questions after time, like, how did you do that, Natalie? When at first, especially the people who are the most critical. And so I think there's a way that you can do things tastefully without just, airing all your dirty garbage, right? But if you can say, okay, this experience shaped me in this way. This is how I felt during that time. And if you use it all from your perspective, then I don't think that there's any wrongdoing there, because you're allowed to share your stories, right? You're allowed to share stories. Now, does that mean you have to tell every single detail of what they were thinking or so-and-so was thinking? No, but if you tell it from your perspective, then I believe that's a right we all have. We all have a right to share our stories. And oftentimes, and this goes to with criticism too, when people are critical of you, oftentimes it's so much more about them than it is about you. And maybe that means that they need to do some work on shame as well, which they probably do. We all do. Every single human does. And so my encouragement to you would be, know that you might get some negative feedback from it. Send them love and just let them know they have some work to do, and just continue to embrace the fact that you want to live a more wholehearted life. You don't want to hide behind shame anymore. The second part, I guess I did tell both parts in that explanation. So the first part was going to be tell your own stories. The second part is you might have some family members who aren't happy, and it's okay to not share every single detail, but if it's not your story to tell, but you can tell it from your experience. Absolutely. Like if you had a family member with a mental health issue, you can, without giving all the details, maybe of their, maybe they did a stint in a mental hospital or the drugs they were taking. You don't have to tell all those details, right? But you can talk about the pain that you experienced, maybe by having your parents, if it was a sibling, focus more on the other sibling, or wondering if you had mental illness, or maybe you did. Like you can pivot it so that way it's more your experience than just laying out all their dirty laundry. Yeah.
Powerful. I also want to extend an olive branch. I think I've struggled with this a lot, so that was a fire question, whoever asked that. And I think that you can also tell the story from an anonymous perspective, where you can allow people to guess who it might have been, but there's no certainty. And I know that that's helped me tremendously in expressing my challenges growing up, and protecting also other people's privacy at the same time. And I do think it's a delicate dance, but that was powerful. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah. And it's also okay to share it in places that aren't so public that your family members are going to see it. Like I mentioned at the beginning, if you need to tiptoe into it at the beginning, that's okay too, right? Like maybe you have private groups that you can share with, or friends. And if that gets you comfortable sharing your stories or getting practice sharing your perspective of the story, then start there. I started with an anonymous blog. And then I kind of tiptoed into using my actual name and putting my face on it. And then, I was so scared the day I told my family I was doing this, even though I'd been doing it for 2 years, right? And it's okay to tiptoe into it if you need to get more comfortable.
Powerful. What else we got, Amy?
All right. How did you go from being vulnerable to sharing your insecurities to being an expert?
So here's the interesting, and Taryn, that's a great question. So here's the interesting part about it. I really still don't consider myself an expert in a lot of the areas that people know me for. And I think a lot of times we think that we can't start until we've hit the peak, so to speak, right? Until we've accomplished the thing or done something great. But kind of that hero's 2 journey that I was talking about earlier, the truth is most people are actually much more interested in the journey along the way than even achieving the thing. Going back to Hollywood, right? I have kids here, so this might be an example for some of us kids, but the movie Cars, anybody know the Disney or the Pixar movie Cars? Lightning McQueen doesn't actually win the piston cup at the end, right? But you love him because you see he's egotistical, and then he gets on the wrong road, and then he has to, work his way to the final race. And you love him because you see the struggles that he went through along the way. Rocky, right? Rocky doesn't beat Apollo Creed at the end, but you love Rocky, Adrian, right? You see his struggles, and he doesn't win at the end. So I think a lot of times we think we can't start sharing until we are the expert. But what I found is I just started sharing when I had no following, zero, your dog probably had more followers than I did. And I just started sharing. I started posting. Now, when I started, I started with a blog. If I were to start over square one today, I probably would just do that on social media. And I just started sharing my experiences, what I had gone through and what I had learned from that. And what it does is it helps other people say, oh, somebody else has gone through this. And if they worked through it, maybe I could too, right? Giving people some guidance along the way, making them feel less alone. And I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I could give is don't wait to share stories until you think you've become an expert. Start sharing right now. A lot of times we think we have to be an expert. You don't. You just have to be 2 steps ahead of somebody else who's struggling with something that you did when you were in their shoes. And then you can start to help them along the way. From a business, inside my own business, for example, I do a lot of digital products, so ebooks. My number one best-selling ebook, I wasn't an expert on that topic. It's kind of a long story. I'll make it really short. I was filming a workout class, and I have 2 10-pound babies. I peed my pants on camera. It was so embarrassing. Like, I literally wanted to light a match to that recording and never, ever broadcast it. Well, it ended up getting released. And what ended up happening is all these women started coming like, oh my gosh, Natalie, that happens to me too. So I partnered with a doctor who knew how to improve this. We wrote an ebook, but it was the story that people related with. My Crockpot Cookbook is my number 2 best-selling ebook. I'm not a trained chef. I just started sharing all the story, like my failed recipes, right? I started showing normally we show the beautiful plated thing. I started showing the behind the scenes mess of like kids running around the kitchen and vegetables sprouting when I forgot that they were in the bottom drawer, right? Like, that happened to everybody. And people were like, oh my gosh, like maybe if she could make those meals, I could too. And I started selling copies of my cookbook. And so I think if I could just give you a little bit of positive encouragement, it's that start sharing your stories right now, because even if we think we're not experts in an area, which most of us don't, most people have a hard time seeing their own strengths, right? But the truth is you've gone through an experience that could help somebody else. You have something that you like to do that might not seem hard to you, but to somebody else might really struggle with. We have a girl in our program who created a whole course on organizing pantries. I was like, oh my gosh, I need this course. And I showed her my pantry. She's like, I have hives coming out right now, Natalie. And she was like, I didn't even think organizing pantries was like hard. Like, that's just always been easy. And I'm like, yeah, that's why I'll buy your course, because it's easy for you. You might not think of yourself as an expert, but for somebody like me, that's really hard for me to do, even though it sounds simple. And so she started sharing stories about how she learned how to organize pantries, and people started coming to her for advice because they're like, oh, at one point her pantry looked like a mess like mine did. Okay. And this is how she worked through it. Cool. And they started following her. And once they knew that like she related to him, she wasn't just this perfect organized person all around. Then they started to, trust her. Like, okay, she struggles at times like I do, and this is how she worked through it. I can trust her advice. And it's the same with friendships too. How many of you guys have ever been in I say mom's group a lot, but friend circles where you have like that one person who always has their stuff together, and it's like hard to get close to those kind of people. But when you have another friend who's like, yep, I fed my kids Costco muffins for breakfast this morning too. High five, you're like, okay, they get it, right? And it's like a sigh of relief, like, okay, I belong here. And the more that you can do that with people, the closer your friendships get, the closer your relationships get.
Powerful. We got a bunch more questions
yeah.
that came through, so
Yeah.
let's just keep them coming. Thank you, Amy.
All right. Yeah, of course. Do you ever have fears that when being vulnerable, your story will make you feel so different than the person you are now, and then you will lose credibility in the person you have grown to be?
Great question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that really falls back to the concept of identity, right? And to me, identity is the most powerful thing. In fact, really focusing in on identity is what changed my life. And identity is the story that you tell yourself about yourself. But the cool part about identity is that it's malleable. And so I think a lot of times, and this is a great question because this really defines me and my timeline as a person. So 10 years ago, Natalie, I was not, everything that you saw was like, oh, look at my perfect 1-year-old birthday party with the homemade cupcakes. And yeah, I did those things, but people didn't see behind the scenes that my marriage was falling apart and that we were drowning in debt. And I only showed people the pretty parts that I wanted people to see. And as a result, inside, I felt empty because I felt all alone. I felt like I am portraying this perfect image of this person that I think everybody wants me to be, but I'm not showing anybody like me, like what's actually happening. They are getting a part of me, but not all of it. And I started just to realize that system is not serving me. And I had to start to break that down and rebuild it back up. And it wasn't easy. And I'm not going to promise that it's going to be easy. But what I can promise is that as I followed that process, I became a better person. Like, I built true confidence because I knew that the person that I was portraying myself as wasn't like a shadow or a shell of who I really was. It was me. And I just accepted. I said, people can take it or leave it. And if they don't like me, that's not a reflection of me. That's just not a good fit. And I did lose some friends along the way for sure. And I just kept telling myself, don't take it personal. But the friends that stayed, they were the friends that I wanted to keep. They were the people that I wanted in my circle. And as I started to do that process, it wasn't easy all the time. There were times where I'm like, why, Natalie? Like, what are you doing to yourself? But I swear to you, 10 years, with 10 years of hindsight, I am such a happier person because I don't have dark secrets that I am worried that people might figure out. People know who I am and they can love me for it or they don't. And typically what I find though is because I'm more willing to be open about my stuff that I used to hide, other people it gives them, by default, it gives them permission to also be open up and be real. And so you're like, by default, giving people a permission slip to also be real and connect. And you get better friendships that way. And so, yeah, it's really hard. And sometimes if you just address it straight on, right? Like if maybe you've portrayed this perfect person online. I did that at the beginning. I said, all right, guys, spoiler alert, I haven't always been real sharing everything. I've shared the pretty stuff and I just want to live a more wholehearted life. I can't remember exactly how I worded it, but I'm ready to just pull back the curtain and just start sharing all the things. And I know some of you guys might come along for the journey and some of you guys might not like it, and that's okay. And I love you anyways. But this is the decision that I'm making. And I just started doing it. And I know that might not be the answer you wanted to get, but I think you'll be surprised though, is that you'll be happier, a lot happier, because you won't feel like you have to strategically tell only this part of the story or that part of the story. You can just be all out there and let people love you or not.
All right. I understand the importance of vulnerability with personal relationships. Where and how can vulnerability be helpful in business?
I love this question. So a lot of times, so two things. One, I think in our day and age, most businesses have an element of a personal brand to it, even if it's not like Next Level University, right? We know it doesn't, I mean, just like how Amy stepped in, you guys know who Amy is, even though her name isn't like the face of the company. We know who you guys are. And so there always is an element of personality to any business. So my dad asked me a really similar question. He owns an insurance company and he's like, Natalie, how the heck am I supposed to be vulnerable when I run an insurance company and I'm 55 years old? And I was like, okay, Dad, let's work on this. And I said, gave him the same advice I just gave you guys. I said, let's tiptoe into it. And I said, being vulnerable doesn't mean you have to always share the heavy, heavy stuff, right?
Good job, baby.
Maybe that means that you share a behind the scenes of a staff meeting, right? Maybe when somebody walks in wearing mismatched shoes one day on accident, you share a picture of that and you get people to laugh. Maybe that means, you screwed up your internet bill and you've sent it to the wrong address and your internet went out for the day and you can laugh at yourself about it instead of like, oh my gosh, people are gonna think we don't have money, right? I said, those are the little things you can start by sharing and they're little pieces of vulnerability. It's pulling back the curtain. Now, if you wanna go into it more, maybe now that you have your business, talk about the early years, right? That's more of a scar than an open wound. Talk about how much you struggled when you were starting your business and how you had to go to grandpa and get a loan to get the business started. And you had a lot of heaviness and fear, wondering if this was even going to work. Could you provide for your family? You had little kids at home. Like, start crafting that story. You're far enough removed from it now that it's not going to like impact you the way as if it was going on in this moment, but start sharing the story so people know that there's a face behind the brand. And I think any of us can do that in our own businesses. People love hearing the behind the scenes. Maybe if you're in the startup phase of your business, start telling some stories of what even piqued your interest in starting this business. Maybe an experience you had as a child that helped you realize that, being a business owner was cool. Or maybe maybe tell a story of how the longest time you thought business owners were evil because Hollywood always portrays like wealthy people as evil, right? I mean, there's so many angles you can take without having to like bare your guts to the world, but getting people to really get some insight into who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. And when people know the why behind what you're doing, they're so much more likely to follow.
Powerful.
Hold on. Okay. What are some tips for you to turn insecurities into confidence within?
Good question. So I love this topic because, again, if you would have met me in college, you would have said, Natalie, yeah, she's happy. She's always nice to everybody. She's positive. But inside, I was not. I had no confidence. I was always worried about what people thought about me. I was worried about what people were going to say. And I can tell you now, like it's different. I have like real inner confidence where I still do think about what people say. And I don't know if that'll ever go away, but I don't let it impact me as a person the way that I used to. And for me, there were two different key things that I started doing. One, I love whiteboards. In fact, I might even pull it out here if I can find my eraser. So I am a whiteboard junkie and I love whiteboards. And I started this process years ago in college. And I started realizing that like I was portraying to everybody that I was more successful than I really was, which was silly because I was doing a ton of cool stuff back then. But I would always like stretch the truth a little bit and be like, yeah, but I'm doing this cool thing. And I realized it was like not good for my psyche because what it was doing is the person I was portraying internally, I knew I wasn't as good as that person because I wasn't. And I started like realizing, okay, Natalie, you got to hone this in. You've got to figure out how to like just one, be the person you actually are and not try to pretend like you're being somebody else. But two, you've got to learn to prove to yourself that you can say you're going to do something and then actually do it. And so I learned this process, and it's going to sound kind of silly, maybe, but it works. And I still do this today, like a long time later. I'm 35. So how long ago was college? I don't know, 14 years later, 13 years later. So I have a thing, I call it micro goals. By the way, I also have the handwriting of like a 5th grade boy. So if you can't read this,
that's what Alan's looks like. So we'll be able to read it just fine.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's ready for this. Don't worry.
So I break this into 3 quadrants. Okay. So over here's personal. Over here's either business, or if you don't own a business, then I would just do finance, right? Like what your savings, things like that, spending. And then down here is family. And now when I was married, my husband had a 4th quadrant, but, and then this is the trick, guys. And this is a really important thing. And all my markers are over there. So I'm going to have to only use one color, but, I only write 3 things. That's it. Okay. 3 things in each category. Now, if you're anybody like me, I start writing a to-do list and it becomes 300 things. And then all of a sudden you're like, I can't do this all. Screw it. I'm just going to hide this and I don't want to look at it. And I'm going to go do something else. So this was really important. And I call it micro goals. And there's a reason. Now, micro goals doesn't mean you don't set big goals. You do. But you can't have a big goal without figuring out the tactical steps that you need to do to make that happen. And so what I do is I look at my week and I say, all right, what are realistically, what are 3 things? Now it's going to challenge me a little bit. I always talk about 1% improvements, but it's something that I can actually realistically do. For some of you guys, this is going to be the hardest part because we want to write, I'm going to work out 7 days a week for an hour each day, right? Like we want to push ourselves. But there's a reason I do it this way, and it's because I learned to retrain my brain. And there's a lot of science behind this actually about you can shift the way that the neurons in your brains fire. So I write like realistic, extremely realistic things that I'm going to get done that week. So for example, I might say, all right, I'm going to wake up and have 8 ounces of water 5 times a week. Okay. For me, that's realistic. Maybe I'll say, all right, I haven't been that good at reading lately, but I can listen to audibles when I'm driving the kids to school. So I'm going to listen to 15 minutes of Audible 4 times a week. Okay. And then maybe the last one is, whatever it is for you. Maybe it's, I want to only drink on the weekends. Maybe it's that I want to go for a family walk 3 nights a week, whatever that is. And then you do similar things for family and for business, right? So maybe it's like, okay, I'm going to limit my Amazon purchases this week to only 1 day a week or a certain dollar amount. Maybe it's, all right, we know we want to go to Disneyland this summer. maybe with COVID, and that's going to cost X amount of dollars. There's, 30 weeks until then. Let's figure out how much we have to save every single week, every single day. You start writing those down. And then family, even if you don't have kids, mine are usually kids related, but it could be as much as I'm going to put my cell phone in the kitchen at night. So that way I'm not on my phone all night with my spouse next to me. Or maybe I'm going to make a micro goal of send one text to a family member, letting them know I love them this week. Maybe my kids are at college and I'm going to send them some homemade brownies in the mail, right? Whatever that looks like to you. 3 things. That's it. Don't do 4, don't do 5, 3, and make them measurable. And then I usually take a big red fat marker, but they're all the way over there. So every time I do it, I put a big fat red check mark. And what's really cool is by the end of the week, this whole thing hopefully is full with red check marks, and you see it. You see this every single day. And then at the end of the week, you reevaluate. And if you didn't hit your goals, don't beat yourself up over it. Just say, all right, well, sometimes I call it an experiment. This was data in my experiment, and I'm going to implement good, better, best. I wanted to do best, but if I couldn't do best, I'm going to give myself permission to do better. If I can't do better, I'm going to give myself permission to do good. And then we reevaluate. And if your goals were too hard last week, then let's scale them back a little bit, because the goal is you want this to be able to have all your check marks. And what this process does is it teaches you that you can say you're going to do something and then actually do it. And then each week, if you're hitting those, you can turn it up by 1%. And there's something with habits called habit stacking. I learned this from a book called Atomic Habits, by the way. If you haven't read it, it's so good, by James Clear. And most of us, in fact, it's beginning of January almost, so this is probably pretty applicable. What happens January 1st for most people? I'm going to change my whole lifestyle, right? I'm going to start going to the gym. I'm going to eat healthier. Oh, maybe I'm going to try keto. Maybe I'm going to revamp everything. Oh, and I'm going to get 8 hours of sleep a night. And what happens 2 weeks later? It doesn't work, because we tried to change everything. So studies have proven that when you try to change just one habit at a time, you have about a 70% success rate. When you try to add 2 habits at the exact same time, your chances of success go down to 30%. When you try to do 3 habits at a time, it's less than 1% success rate. And so instead, what I do is I focus on, all right, let's make things realistic. Let's make that our base. And then let's increase 1%, because most of us try to change 30% at a time. If you try to do that and it doesn't, you're probably going to fail. But if you can do 1% at a time, you'll eventually get to that 30%. It'll just be sustainable. It'll actually work. So anyways, that was a really, really long answer to your question. But for me, I had to put realistic tactical tips in place like those that helped me, because I'm somebody that wants to I want to do all the things. I want to change the world. I want to do the big things. Oh, I don't want to just start running. I'm going to run a marathon. That's just who I am. That's how I'm wired. But it doesn't always work that way. And so I had to put tactical steps in place to get me to that end result that was giving me momentum along the way. And one of the things I always say is any kind of action, even if it's imperfect, is what creates momentum. And so I'm always looking for ways that I can create momentum, because when you're having positive momentum by default, that's going to create confidence. So I could keep going and going on that topic, but that is my take on that.
We have one more question in the chat for right now. What do you believe is the most impactful distinction between self-belief and self-worth or value, especially for someone who desires to uncover what their version of living a life wholeheartedly looks like?
Natalie, before you hammer this, we're at the 9-minute left mark. So just FYI.
Thank you for keeping me on track. These guys, they know, you guys. For everybody else here, I tend to well, you've seen it already. I'm like, oh, I want to go on that topic.
I was wondering if we could just turn the camera off and leave, because I'm sure you would keep adding value, and it's you don't even need us here. So, but I just wanted to give you a heads up.
I probably would. Okay, here's my answer to that. The biggest thing that changed my life. About 5, almost 6 years ago now, I went through a divorce, and I was not only broke, but I was just very broken. I didn't see any value in myself, and I wondered, I had a lot of shame about how I was going to provide for these 2 little kids that I had. And I stumbled across something, and I wish I knew where I heard it. It probably was something from Tom Bilyeu, but I learned to recognize the difference from just because I failed doesn't mean I'm a failure. Okay, very small difference in language, massive difference in how it impacts you. One is an act, and one is your identity. Okay, just because I screwed up doesn't mean I am a screw up. Just because I made a mistake doesn't mean I am a mistake. And whenever I would beat myself up over past mistakes that I had made, I would go back to that. I mean, I've repeated that mantra in my head probably a million times by now. And I'd say, I'd have shame over decisions I had made or mistakes I had made, failures I had had. And I'd say, just because you failed doesn't mean you are a failure, Natalie. And then I would tell myself, Natalie, you were doing the best that you knew with what you had at the time. Now, it might not be the best that you know now, but it was the best that I knew at the time. And show yourself some grace. And then what I do is I love using the word an experiment, because when I screw up, it makes me feel less worse if I just tell myself, all right, well, this was just data in my experiment. Let's pivot and reposition. Let's do less of what didn't work and more of what did work. And if you're brave enough, when you fail, right, it's like you're face down in the dirt. If you fail, but you're brave enough to dust your knees off and stand back up and try again, and then you say, all right, the key is you have to look at all right, and it hurts sometimes to look at your failures and you say, all right, I take responsibility for my role in this. This is what I could have done better. And then you try to do better next time. And maybe you don't get it perfectly and you might fall down again. But when you just stay falling down, that's where you're going to stay exactly where you're at. And in order to live that wholehearted life, you have to be brave enough to stand back up, to own your mistakes, and then just say, all right, let's pivot and reposition. Let's try this again. And I think it's the grit and the tenacity that's developed from doing that over and over and over again that actually creates so much more success than the thing that we're trying to achieve. And I mean, for years, I had that written on my whiteboard. Just because you failed doesn't mean you're a failure. And pivot and reposition. I mean, I have certain keyword phrases that as soon as I see them, it's a affirmation for me, and it can instantly change my state. And so if you're struggling with that, what I would encourage you to do is find some of those words that are meaningful to you, that are powerful to you. I have mine. They're in a highlights bubble. I think it's called quotes on Instagram. You can take mine if you want. I have this weird quirk about me where I write them on giant Post-it notes and I put them on walls all over my house, and even in my bathroom, because I'm where's one place everybody sits at least once a day, right? And I read them and I say them out loud. And there's a lot of science behind saying words out loud. And at first I thought that was mumbo jumbo and silly and weird. And then I started doing it and it worked. And so that's what I would encourage you to do, is just remind yourself, just because I failed doesn't mean I'm a failure. Start taking in stories of other people who have failed and gotten back up and using that as inspiration and pivoting and repositioning and trying again. So.
Natalie, your ability to answer questions, storytell, and stay on is unbelievable. Genuinely.
Thank you.
Do we want to let Amy play us out, and then we'll...
Yeah, so Natalie, I just want to say thank you so much for this. I wish we had more time. I'm sure everyone in here wishes you had more time as well. And also the fact that you are struggling with COVID right now and still showed up for all of us. I want everyone to know that, because it's a true testament to the grit that you just described. You still showed up for us, and thank you so much. We appreciate you very much, and it's been awesome getting to know you at a deeper level, also behind the scenes with your business and what you're doing in the world. That's what Kevin and I want to do, is help perpetuate the good work that people like you do. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone for asking awesome questions, and let's ride on out of here.
Thank you, Natalie. We love you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, you guys.
Of course. Amy, play us out.
Okay. So if anybody here is not in Next Level Nation on Facebook, I highly encourage you to join that community. It's extremely supportive. It has so many like-minded people. You will get to hear a lot from me and from other team members, as well as other members of the community. If obviously you listen to the podcast, so if you guys wouldn't mind, if you could go on Apple Podcasts and rate and review, that would be super helpful. I know Kevin and Alan would really, really appreciate that. And then next week's Mastermind will be on the sales cycle, right?
Yeah, so I'll do a little pitch on that.
Yeah, I can pitch away.
Natalie, this is actually what I had shown you on the Zoom recording earlier this week.
Yeah, this is awesome. Alan showed this to me the other day in a private call, and it's fantastic. You guys should really hop on for it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right, you did the work for me. Yeah, so it's a simple 4-step system. What I've found with people is that they're doing a part of it really well, but if there's a kink in the hose, you're not going to get the full flow of clients and money and profitability and impact, most importantly, impact. Natalie knows as well as Kevin and I do, money is the lifeblood of your business. And if you're an early entrepreneur, you need to learn how to sell, period. It is what it is. And instead of sell, let's change it to empower. Every time Natalie sells a course for, I believe it's Peak Performance Academy, is that what it is?
Yes, Academy, yeah.
Yeah, so it's impact, and that's a life she would have never been able to impact otherwise. Speaking of which, before we head on out of here, tell the listeners where they can find more of you. I know we had put her Instagram handle in the chat, and that's typically the best place to get a hold of you. But tell us about what you do and what else you can do for our listeners.
Yeah, so our two main programs right now that we're talking about, I have a 21-day challenge, which actually a lot of what I talked about in here, I teach in depth in our 21-day challenge. It's how to get unstuck so you can rewrite your story. And I love doing these challenges. Week 1 is internal reasons you get stuck. Week 2 are external reasons. And week 3 are the tools you need to work through it. And we're starting our next one on January 11th. If anybody's interested, that's challenge.nataliehodson.com. And then I also have my Peak Business Academy, which teaches people how to do what I've done. So how to build an audience of raving fans that love and trust you, even if you don't feel like you're an expert, you're not techie like me, you don't want to deal with any Facebook ads, and how you can turn that into a wildly profitable online business. So that's a course that I've created, and we have an amazing community in there. I'm doing a free web class tomorrow teaching kind of the 3 secrets behind that. If anybody's interested, it's free. And that if you go to my Instagram bio, the links are all in there if you want to register for that. So.
Awesome.
We appreciate you. We're so grateful for you. And again, we're so happy to see you doing what you do in the world. And you are the same person behind the scenes as you are in front of the camera. And that's always our favorite thing. And let us know if there's anything we can do to help. And we appreciate you, Natalie.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, you guys. Have a wonderful night.
You as well. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the one and only Natalie Hodson.
Talk to you soon.
Bye, guys.